NASA have decided to go back to the moon. They're sending like actual human beings. It's a manned space program to the moon, and this time it's called the Artemis program. You guys know the one in the 60s was the legendary Apollo program. This is the Artemis program, and they just launched the first rocket. It's an unmanned rocket. It's, before they actually send humans, they always conduct tests. So they'll send an unmanned craft, and then they'll send another crew to do an orbit, but they don't actually land, which must be an extraordinary tease. And then they actually land a crew, and they're aiming for 2025. And this is substantial because you can't talk about space and the space race without, talking about politics. So I think, I've been wanting to do a segment about this for a long time. And I think the launch, which took place November 16th, so just a few days ago, is extremely relevant and a good segue to do that. Let me just play you the clip very briefly from NASA launching the first rocket.
Up until T-minus 2 seconds.
Go for ALS.
And we are go for ALS. Maiden voyage to the moon. Silencer pressure water now
15.
Flowing under the ML. And here we go.
10.
Hydrogen burn-off igniters initiated. 7, 6, 5. 4-stage engine start. 3, 2, 1. Boosters in ignition. And liftoff of Artemis 1. We rise together back to the moon and beyond.
All 4 RS-25 engines on the core stage and 2 solid rocket boosters now propelling the vehicle at 128 miles per hour.
It's absolutely insane. Within the span of 2 minutes, that rocket is doing something around 4,000 miles per hour, right? And that's before separation. So they're just exiting the atmosphere. It's amazing. So let me talk about why this is significant. The last time there was a manned space program to the moon, I think the last moon landing was 1972, if I'm not mistaken. So, that's a long time ago. That's many, many decades. It was during the Cold War. And I wanted to talk about this because people have this misconception that the United States is the one that won the space race in the Cold War. And that's not true. It's really not true. The reason people have this, this misconception is because Hollywood are very good at propaganda, right? I'm sure you've all seen, what was it, Apollo 11 with Tom Hanks, or Apollo 13? I forgot, Christ. But, they have a lot of good movies about the space program. There are some new ones that also came out recently with, what was his name? Ryan Gosling, First Man. So they have so many really intricate, personal, and they're great at storytelling, and they create this amazing bond between the characters in the movie and the viewer. And so you fall into this trap of thinking that, well, that program is the superior one. They're clearly the best. And it's not true. And I will show you literally right here why it's not true. Every single milestone, major milestone in space, it was the Soviets who did it. They had the first satellite in space, the first animal in space, the first lunar satellite flyby. So that's the first satellite doing flyby of the moon. First lunar contact. So if I recall correctly, they put the first man-made object on the moon. The first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, right? He orbited the Earth. First planetary flyby that went to Venus. The first woman in space. The first spacewalk. The first lunar landing. I mean, this is crazy. This is all the Soviets. And NASA were getting their butts kicked for years. For years. It was so embarrassing. Every time they launched something, it would just blow up or go up in flames. And the Soviets, milestone after milestone. And then eventually they got their act together at NASA and they did the first spacecraft docking and lunar human flyby. So that's what they're going to do with this new Artemis program, where you put a human in the capsule and they fly around the moon and back to Earth. They don't actually land, right? Because again, it's part of the safety process and testing. Soviets had the first modular space station. That's very crucial because what the Americans want to do now with the European Space Agency and Canada with this new moon program, they want to build something similar to the International Space Station. So they're not just going back to the moon. They're going to build a space station that constantly, permanently orbits the moon. That's very significant. And of course, those things are always modular, but the Soviets were first to do it. And then 1969, you have the first human moon landing, Neil Armstrong. The Soviets put the first rover on the moon, though. That's interesting, right? First planetary landing on Venus, first space station, and first Mars landing. I mean, I'm sorry, but the list speaks for itself. I really don't know how anyone can dispute this. It's a clear win for the Soviets, whether you like it or you don't like it. I think, I know it's all about the science, but it's also about politics. During the Cold War, NASA had a budget, I think, what was it? They had 5% of the national budget going towards NASA. Now it's barely 1%. It's been deprioritized because there's no more space race with the Soviets. You don't have to, there's no need to look good in front of the world anymore and prove that capitalism is the superior program or whatever. So nevertheless, I think it's cool that they're doing this. I really hope they're not going to do this to weaponize space. During the 80s under Reagan, there was this proposal to put weapons in space, and they actually called it the Star Wars program, right? So I know there's some people who believe that they actually went ahead with it and they have like nukes on the moon or something. I really hope that that's not true. But this program, the new one, Artemis, I'll just read you the stated goals. Okay, so there's no mention of weapons, obviously. But I'll show you what they're going to do here and what the timeline. So the first use of the Space Launch System, okay, Orion, that was the one I just showed you, is November 16th, okay? And they have robots and mannequins aboard this one that we just watched. The second Artemis launch in 2024. The third will be in 2025, and that's going to be a crewed lunar landing. So they're saying in the span of 3 years, they're going to go from first launch to actually putting people on the moon. And then they're going to dock in 2027 with the Lunar Gateway. That's what they're calling this space station. So it's very interesting. And it's so funny seeing this logo there, United States Space Force. You remember Trump created this? That was really funny. Because in the U.S. you have several branches of the military. You have the Marines, which are separate from the Navy. Then you have the Navy, the Air Force, the Army, and then Space Force, which Trump created. And apparently it's still there. So, okay, I'm pointing this out because, this is supposed to be a strictly civilian, well, not civilian, it's certainly government, but I mean, it's supposed to be a non-military application. But when you see the United States Space Force, which is an actual branch of the U.S. military involved, I don't know what to think of that. I'm not going to speculate. I'm just going to say it's cool that they're doing this. It's really nice. And if you watch the full video, it's very long. It was a live stream. They talk about the rocket being the most powerful ever built. And I was a bit confused by that because my understanding was that the Saturn V was the most powerful rocket ever built. So I guess maybe that's changed now, but don't quote me on that. Saturn V is the rocket that took the Americans to the moon, and this was basically their rival to the Soviets' R7 rocket. And I think the Soviets would have made it first, but there was a lot of one of the leads on the program died, and they switched design for rocket design, and they had hiccups with that, but it's important to remember their contributions and achievements because they're substantial in both in number and also in being first, in coming first. So the other thing to note also is that during the Cold War, when the Soviets and the Americans had the space race, both of them had actually recruited Nazi scientists. So the chief German scientist in the U.S. was Werner von Braun, and he's the guy who designed the first ballistic missile. So we're talking about the V1, which right now they talk about these Iranian drones in Ukraine. They're similar to the V1. Obviously, the V1's a lot more primitive and older, but it's basically a drone that you would launch from the French coast, and then you would give it a finite amount of fuel, knowing that it's going to fall over London. And, that it was called a doodle bug because, you would just hear the motor dying, and then it would just randomly fall and kill people. And my grandmother was hit by one. She didn't die, but she was hit by a V1 in World War II in London. So after the V1, they did the V2, and that's the traditional rocket that you think of when you see a V2. It's not a drone; it's a ballistic missile. And Wernher von Braun is the guy who designed both of these, and he became one of the top people at NASA. Right? He was director, and here's the picture, by the way. I'm trying to show you the V2 rocket. So there it is. So yeah, obviously. The Soviets also, they took some Nazi scientists with them. And of course, this is, extremely, these are some dubious decisions. I don't think that's very, I don't know. I don't know how the Soviets did it, but I know the Americans gave all these people citizenship and immunity. And you have to remember von Braun, sure, he's a technical genius. He's also a Nazi. He was, not just, working for them. No, this guy was in the SS. He was an officer in the SS. So I don't think it's fair to just overlook that. And, all the people that he killed with V1s and V2s in the UK and, absolve him of that. The guy's a murdering Nazi. End of story. And, just because he made the best rocket and the first ballistic missile doesn't make him any better of a person. Which is weird, because I remember when I was in Berlin at the airport, they have a plaque of this guy. I was fucking stunned. I was like, why is there a plaque of this guy here in Berlin? Not America, in Berlin. I was really confused by that. Anyway, I just thought I'd give you an update on the space program and what's happening right now. Interesting times, especially with Elon Musk, being the richest man on Earth. And he has SpaceX, which was, I guess, originally sort of a rival to NASA, but now they work together. Their specialty is having rockets that are reusable, because traditionally when you send a rocket, that's it. You got to build a new one. It's destroyed and gone. The boosters are going to fall apart, and you need to build it from scratch. So it costs much more, right? But if you can reuse the same rocket, it reduces and brings down the costs substantially. So that's the interesting thing about what they've done at SpaceX. Although obviously he is not a rocket engineer; it's the engineers who work for him. So yeah, we'll see what happens. If there's a Mars mission or not. I think that would be cool, but I don't know. They always say they said they were going to do that in 2010, and then 2020 and 2030. They always push it. So